Bruce Lee was mocked. "You're just a trainer," by Foreman. His prowess left George without a word. Bruce Lee's last lesson. The Chinatown Fight Club gym was packed that night. The air smelled of sweat, leather and liniment, while George Foreman, then a young heavyweight on the rise, laughed loudly with his sparring partners. "This Bruce Lee guy is nothing more than a celebrity trainer, a guy who teaches actors how to pretend to fight," he said, patting a companion on the shoulder. "Let's see if he can take a real punch." Bruce Lee, who watched the scene silently from the corner of the ring, did not react. He just adjusted his training gloves, his dark eyes fixed on Foreman with an intensity that made the giant hesitate for a second. "Do you want to test it?" he asked, his voice calm, almost soft. "Okay. But remember, I don't train to lose." Foreman laughed, leaping into the ring with the confidence of a man who had already knocked out dozens of opponents. "Let's see if your little legs can handle it, Master. What followed was not a fight. It was a lesson. Bruce didn't back down. It didn't block in the traditional style. Instead, he moved like water, dodging Foreman's heavy blows with a fluidity that seemed to defy physics. Each punch from the heavyweight fell inches from his face, but he was always one step ahead, as if anticipating each move. When Foreman tried to grab him, Bruce spun around, applying an armbar that pinned him against the ropes. "You're strong," he said, his voice still calm. "But force without precision is like a cannon without aim." Foreman growled, trying to break free, but Bruce released him before he could react, dancing back with a barely noticeable smile. "Shall we try again?" This time, Foreman attacked with more anger, his punches filled with frustration. Bruce dodged across, countering with a side kick that connected with Foreman's side with the precision of a blade. The giant staggered, eyes wide. "Like you dash?" "You think too much of the power," interrupted Bruce, "and not enough of the target." Before Foreman could recover, Bruce delivered a sequence of blows, jab, straight, roundhouse kick, that pushed him against the ropes. It wasn't a knockout. It wasn't humiliating. It was a demonstration that, in Bruce Lee's world, there was no room for arrogance without skill. Foreman took a deep breath, hands resting on his knees, sweat running down his face. I don't understand," he murmured. Bruce took off his gloves, throwing them into the corner of the ring. "You don't need to understand. You just need to respect." And with that, he left the ring, leaving behind a heavy silence and a champion who, for the first time, had been left speechless. Years later, in a bar in Las Vegas, Foreman, now a retired former champion, was telling the story to a group of young fighters. "I thought he was just a trainer. But that man, he didn't fight. He danced with violence." One of the listeners laughed. "So what? You lost to him?" Foreman looked at his glass of whiskey, slowly swirling it. "No. I never challenged him again." And in his voice, there was something that none of those present could decipher, whether it was respect, admiration, or the echo of a lesson he would never forget. Bruce Lee was no longer there to listen. But his shadow, the one that had taught Foreman and so many others that true martial art was not about dominating others, but about dominating oneself, remained. And maybe, somewhere, he was still smiling. The bar was filled with smoke and the muffled murmur of lost bets, forced laughter, and the occasional clink of bottles. Foreman continued, his voice low, almost as if he were speaking only to himself. "He once told me, water doesn't fight stone. It surrounds it, wears it away, until the stone is nothing more than sand." I laughed in his face. I thought strength was everything. But in that ring, when he moved, it wasn't a fight. It was something else. Something I didn't have a name for. One of the young men, a middleweight with scars on his knuckles, crossed his arms. "So you gave up? After all you trained?" Foreman looked up, and for an instant, the glow of the neon lights reflected off them like blades. "I didn't give up. I understood." He slammed the glass down on the table with enough force to make the amber liquid spill over. "That man didn't want to beat me. He wanted me to see what I couldn't see. That anger, pride, the need to crush the other, all of that was current. And he was offering me the key. Silence. Even the jukebox seemed to hold its breath. I never challenged him again because after that night, there was nothing left to prove. Not to him. Not to me. Foreman took a deep breath, as if the Las Vegas air still carried the weight of that lesson. But that doesn't mean I've stopped fighting. The middleweight frowned. Against who, then? Foreman smiled, a slow, almost sad smile. Against the guy I was before I met him. Against the idea that winning is just knocking someone down. He stood up, throwing some bills on the table. And against the shadow he left. Because, in the end, we never really win. We just learn to dance with it. The young men stood there, staring at the empty space where Foreman had been. One of them, the youngest, with eyes still bright from dreams of glory, murmured, "I wish I had met this guy." The bartender, who had heard everything while drying a glass, shook his head. "You already know it. It's in every punch you don't throw. In every blow you hold back. In every time you choose not to be what others expect." He placed the glass on the counter with a dry click. Bruce Lee didn't die. He just spread. Outside, the Nevada desert indifferently swallowed the city lights. But somewhere, between the memories of a former champion and the doubts of young fighters, the lesson remained a fluid, relentless, like water. And, like water, it continued to shape everything it touched. The last round. Years passed, and the gymnasium where Foreman had told his story was transformed. The walls, once peeling, now displayed framed photos of fighters who had passed through there, some famous, others forgotten. The bright-eyed young man, now with scars on his knuckles and a shadow of stubble, was one of them. His name, Danny the Phantom Reyes, was engraved on a sign above the ring, middleweight champion, 2005 to 2007. But the title had not brought him peace. That night, Danny sat on the same, now weathered wooden bench, his bandaged hands loose on his knees. The bartender, older and stooped, placed a bottle of whiskey in front of him without saying anything. Danny didn't touch the glass. Instead, he looked at the empty ring, where the ropes were swaying slightly, as if someone had just left. "I won," Danny muttered. "But it wasn't how I thought." The bartender laughed, a dry sound like dry leaves. "No one wins like they think. Do you think Foreman woke up champion? That Bruce woke up master? They woke up with bruises, doubts and a bunch of people telling them it wasn't going to work." Danny clenched his fists. "I can't take it anymore." "Then stop. It's not that simple." "And yes." The bartender filled his own glass. "You just don't want to admit that you're scared." Danny stood up suddenly, knocking over the bench. The sound echoed through the empty gym. "Afraid of what? Of losing? To become a joke? I'm already a joke. Everyone thinks I only won because the other fighter broke his ankle. That I'm just a stroke of luck with legs. That's not what you're afraid of." The bartender didn't move. "You're afraid of being good and still not being enough. Fear that, even if you beat everyone, you will still wake up alone, with the same doubts, the same ghosts. Fear that, in the end, the fight will never end." Danny took a deep breath, shoulders shaking. Then, as if something inside him had snapped, he turned and walked to the ring. He climbed between the ropes, stepped into the center and looked down at the floor, where years before Foreman had talked about Bruce Lee. "I don't know how to dance," he said, in a low voice. And then, for the first time in months, he started to move. It wasn't training. It wasn't a fight. It was something in between, a rhythm he didn't understand, but his body seemed to know. Feet slid, hands rose in guards that weren't guards, blows flowed like water, just as Foreman had described. Danny didn't think. He just was. When he stopped, he was sweating, panting, but smiling like he hadn't smiled in years. The bartender, still sitting in the same place, raised his glass in silence. Now you know him. Danny Reyes fought 3 more times after that night. Lost 2. The last one, against a 20-year-old boy who barely knew how to hold his gloves, was the most difficult. He could have won, he still had technique, he still had strength. But in the 3rd round, when the boy tripped and fell, Danny reached out and helped him up. "You're better than me," he said, as the referee separated them. "Keep it up." The boy, confused, nodded. Danny took off his gloves, left them in the corner of the ring and left without looking back. Years later, in a random bar in Las Vegas, a retired fighter would tell the story of Danny Reyes to a group of young people. "I would say that he had been one of the best, but that he had given up too soon." One of them, the youngest, with eyes bright with dreams of glory, would murmur, "I wish I had met this guy." The retired fighter would shake his head, smiling. "You already know. He's in every punch you don't throw. In every blow you hold. Every time you choose not to be what others expect." And outside, the desert would remain indifferent, but somewhere, between the memories of a former champion and the doubts of new fighters, the lesson would remain fluid, relentless, like water, shaping everything it touched. The last round. Danny Reyes didn't leave the ring that day just because he was tired. He left because, the moment his gloves touched the ground, he understood something that no coach, no opponent, no fan had ever told him, that the hardest fight was not against the opponent, but against the version of himself that others had created. And he no longer knew which of the two was true. The first few months after giving up were the strangest. Danny woke up before dawn, as always, but instead of running through the streets of Reno, he stood on the balcony of the small apartment he rented near the airport, watching the planes take off. "Sometimes I dreamed of the sound of the gong. Others, with the silence that came after defeat." But what haunted him most were not the memories of the fighting, but rather their absence. As if, when he threw down the gloves, he left behind not just a career, but a part of his own voice. He tried to distract himself. He worked as a security guard in casinos, as an instructor in a rundown gym, even as an app driver on nights when the Nevada desert seemed to swallow him alive. But nothing filled the void. Then, one night, while driving aimlessly along Highway 95, he heard an interview on the radio with a former wrestler who had become a pastor. The man talked about redemption, about how the ring was just a stage for something bigger. Danny turned off the radio before the word God was mentioned. It wasn't faith he lacked. It was purpose. It was in a roadside bar, one of those places with the smell of spilled beer and a broken jukebox, that he found the envelope. It sat on the counter, next to a half-empty bottle of whiskey, with his name written in a handwriting he instantly recognized, that of his old coach, Mickey O'Shea. Inside was a yellowed photo of 18-year-old Danny, thin and hungry, posing next to Mickey after his first professional victory. On the back, a sentence scrawled, "You always knew where to go. You just forgot the way." Danny closed his eyes. He remembered the smell of liniment on Mickey's hands, the way the old coach would spit into the bucket between rounds, the way he would say, "Breathe, boy, breathe," as if it were the only thing that mattered in the world. He also remembered the last conversation they had, months before Danny abandoned everything. Mickey had asked, "Do you still fight for yourself, or just for them?" And Danny hadn't known how to answer. He put the photo in his pocket and left the bar. He didn't come home. Instead, he drove to the old gym where he'd started, a red brick building that now housed an auto parts store. He stopped on the sidewalk, looking at the dirty windows. Inside, he imagined, there would still be the marks of his punches on the walls, the sweat stains on the floor, the echo of screams that never completely went away. It was then that he saw the boy. He was leaning against a lamppost, smoking a cigarette as if it were the most natural thing in the world, even though he couldn't have been more than 17. He wore a worn-out jacket with the logo of a gym that Danny didn't recognize and looked at him with a mixture of defiance and curiosity. "You're Danny Reyes," said the boy, putting out his cigarette with the tip of his sneaker. Danny didn't respond. He just nodded. "My coach talks about you." Says you were too fast for your own good. Danny laughed, a dry, joyless sound. Your coach is wrong. I was too slow. The boy frowned, as if he didn't understand. And maybe he didn't understand. How could I? He still believed that speed was measured in milliseconds, not regrets. Are you going back? Asked the boy, after a silence. Danny looked down at his hands. There were still calluses on his knuckles, scars that time had not erased. Not the way you think. Years later, when the retired wrestler in the Las Vegas bar finished telling the story of Danny Reyes, the bright-eyed boy would ask. And what happened to him? The old fighter would take a sip of his drink before answering. He found something more difficult than winning. He found a way to live without having to prove anything. And the boy? The fighter smiled, as if the answer was obvious. The boy became champion. But that's another story. Outside, the Nevada desert remained the same, vast, unforgiving, indifferent. But somewhere, between the memories of those who once were great and the dreams of those who still believed they were great, Danny Reyes' lesson remained. Not as a warning, nor as advice, but as a simple, hard and inevitable truth, that the fight never ends. Just change rings. The old fighter, whose hands still had the calluses from the ropes and the weight of the punches he was no longer landing, placed the glass on the counter with a slow gesture, as if each movement carried the weight of decades. The bright-eyed boy sitting next to him didn't look away, hoping the next words would fill the void left by Danny Reyes' story. The bar, with its amber lights and the low hum of an old jukebox, seemed to hold its breath along with him. Danny didn't disappear from the map after that night, continued the fighter, running his thumb along the rim of the glass. He returned to the gym where it all began, that place stinking of sweat and liniment, with the ceiling cracked and the ring worn with time. But he didn't get on it. Not this time. Instead, he picked up a broom and began sweeping the floor, as he did when he was a teenager, before he dreamed of belts and crowds. The coach, a grumpy old man named Sal who had seen dozens of kids like Danny pass by, looked at him suspiciously. What are you doing here, champion? Did you come to rub it in my face that I was wrong to put you in the fight? Danny leaned the broom against the wall and faced Sal. There was no anger in his eyes, no bitterness. Just a strange calm, like you'd spent years running towards something and then suddenly realized you never needed to get there. I came to ask if you still need help cleaning the place. And if you still accept students. Sal spat on the floor, a habit he had never abandoned, and crossed his arms. You are no longer a student. You are history. And history does not sweep floors. Danny smiled, a smile that had nothing to do with the forced smiles of interviews or the arrogance of winners. Then let me be something else. And that's how Danny Reyes, the fighter who could have been legendary, became the man who swept the gym before practice, who held the kids' gloves while they vomited into the bucket, who whispered breathe when they wanted to give up. He didn't give formal classes, he didn't charge for advice. It was just there, like a shadow that knew more than it let on. The younger boys called him Ghost because he appeared and disappeared without making a sound, and because sometimes, when one of them landed a perfect punch, Danny would smile as if he had seen that moment before, somewhere inside himself. But not everything was peace. There were nights when Danny would wake up sweating, with the taste of blood in his mouth, convinced he was still in the octagon, hearing the crowd chant his name. At those times, he would put on an old sweatshirt, wear worn-out sneakers and go for a run around the neighborhood, until his legs burned and the memory of the ring dissolved in the cold early morning air. Once, a police officer stopped him, thinking he was a thief. Documents. Danny took his wallet out of his pocket slowly, as if every movement could be interpreted as a threat. The officer looked at the ID, then at Danny's scarred face, and something in the fighter's eyes made him step back. Sorry, sir. Have a good run. Danny nodded and continued walking. It was no longer a name on posters, nor a promise. He was just a man running against his own ghosts. Years passed. Sal's gym was renovated, not for money, but but because Danny's now-grown students came back to paint the walls and change the burned-out light bulbs. One of them, a skinny boy named Marco, who had the same bright eyes as the boy who had once heard Danny's story in the Las Vegas bar, stepped into the ring for the first time and looked down to where Danny was holding the ropes. "What if I'm not good enough?" Danny didn't respond right away. He just watched the boy, remembering how he himself trembled before the first fight, how Sal screamed at him, how fear was a concrete weight in his stomach. "You already are," he said at last. "Enough to try. The rest is details." Marco won that fight. And the next one. And the other. Until, one day, he was in the same bar in Las Vegas, telling his own story to a boy with bright eyes, while an old fighter, now with white hair and even more scarred hands, watched from afar, sipping his drink in silence. Outside, the desert remained vast, unforgiving. But inside that bar, between glasses and memories, something was repeated: the fight never ended. It just changed shape. And sometimes the biggest punch a man could throw wasn't in the ring, but in life, when he decided he no longer needed to win to be strong.